I actually feel like the way Muslims think of Zionists right now is the same way that Americans thought of Muslims right after 9/11. It's zero nuance.
Precisely that, and Zionism is an umbrella. Now, I understand, I think many Palestinians would tell you, and I would understand, that we've experienced the consequences of Zionism, if you will, as that their displacement and dispossession is the consequence of Zionism.
I think Islam hates us.
They have done nothing except wreak havoc and terror for our faith and our religion.
Professed values of the Western countries, democracy and constitutional and human rights, at least they should speak about this.
And it's like, I feel like religion just is making it worse. They say they believe in God, but I think they're just anxious.
Before we talk about politics, let's look at the fundamental things.
That when we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad.
And it requires people with guts to follow God in an era that everyone does whatever is right in their eyes.
Will you distance yourself from those who think differently? Or will you join us at the table and talk about what is really important? This is the Al-Ma'idah Initiative, conversation without compromise.
Welcome to the Al-Ma'idah Initiative podcast. Today I am interviewing Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, who, how would you describe yourself? Because you've been called a lot of bad names on the internet over the last year.
I'm a Palestinian American who grew up in Gaza and then in the Middle East, and I work towards pragmatism to try and solve the Israel and Palestine conflict through empathy, humanity, kindness, hard dialogue and engagement and conversations, as well as realistic policy.
And what's your favorite name you've been called this year?
That just happened yesterday. I was called
the final boss of respectability politics.
Yes. I thought that was hilarious, only because I play Doom and Doom Eternal, the video games, and I don't know. I just when I think of the boss in that context, something about it made me feel like I'm one of those Doom bosses, if you will, which is just ironic.
It's actually really, funny in a really tragic way in how people are actually thinking about this kind of thing. You've been working to be balanced and human and pragmatic for actually improving people's lives for the last year. And in somebody's imagination, you're the main problem of what's going on somehow.
Precisely. And also what's interesting is that, I do receive a lot of attacks and vitriol from folks who identify as pro-Israel. And when that happens, and when I do say things that are very unequivocally critical of the Israeli government, Israeli policies, Israeli actions, what I perceive as criminal behavior by the Israeli government, that gets me a lot of attacks and flack by the pro-Israel folks. Those on the pro-Palestine side, they're nowhere to be seen. They don't see that. That doesn't register to them. That to them doesn't exist. That to them is irrelevant. But me somehow connecting with hostage families, engaging in interfaith dialogue, saying that Hamas abusing Islam to justify its rule, to justify its violence and terrorism, is a form of tokenism, and it's appalling that when it comes, unfortunately, there are so few voices like mine, not because they don't exist. There is 1,000 or 10,000 Ahmeds out there, and there's a mini Ahmed in many people's heads, but that Ahmed, whether it be personality-wise or school of thought-wise, is suppressed and repressed there's enforced conformity, enforced cohesion. And this is why it's so rare to find Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims or Palestinian pro-Palestine activists, advocates who are willing to actually be both pro-Palestine and ruthlessly critical of our own failures and shortcomings. And we can get into why that happens, but it embarrasses me that an otherwise highly educated community, highly educated a diaspora community in particular, you have, and particularly in the diaspora, there's such radicalization and overt pro-Hamas, pro-terrorism, anti-Semitic sentiments that are no longer fringe. They are widespread. They are, they've become center stage. That's not to say everybody, obviously. Far from it. I've never generalized or sought to generalize. Nevertheless, it pains me and it hurts the Palestinian cause. And that's what I'm trying to address.
So let's come back to that thread a little later. For now, I actually really want to hear about your story growing up in Gaza, how you ended up in the US, and what your story was up until October 6th last year. And then we'll talk about the last year.
Certainly. Well, so one of the things that's also interesting about my lived experience is that, which is not unusual at all for many Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, is I was actually born in Saudi Arabia, where my dad was working. It's very common for doctors, engineers, nurses, teachers to work in the Gulf to make a living, to save some money, and then bring that back to Gaza and build a home for oneself and family. And my dad did so, and helped his family build a home, and we lived in a family building, a multi-story family building where each uncle had a house, and I lived there. We would move back and forth, and we moved actually and lived a couple of years in the mid-90s in Gaza, and then we'd go back and forth and at least twice a year to Saudi in Gaza. And I experienced the tail end of the Oslo years, and I experienced the hope and the optimism, if you will, of what that era brought to the space in terms of the economic development, the emergence. I mean, we used to have an Egyptian travel document that was not a passport, and that was just a symbol of humiliation, and it was really, really disastrous. And all of a sudden we had this Palestinian Authority green passport. We had a little ID card. There was an airport in Gaza that I flew into in 99, and in the year 2000 there was a mobile company, a telephone company. There was a civil administration that was Palestinian run. And so that was entirely new, and I got to experience that as a child, just seeing it. Obviously, I was young, and I wasn't exactly I was always an old soul in a young body, and I registered quite a bit of that growing up in there. But so I will just say that, and my uncles were day laborers in Israel, and so I got to see what that entailed and how they forged these robust relationships with their colleagues in Israel, and how that was something that meant something to them beyond just making money in there. Gaza, and then I experienced the second Intifada, which started in the year 2000 while I was in the sixth grade. I attended UNRWA schools. My dad was an UNRWA doctor, and when he retired, he passed away 4 years ago, but when he retired, he ran UNRWA's clinic in Jabalia in the north, a place that has been systematically destroyed and completely wiped out by the Israeli military over the past few months. And my oldest brother is in Gaza right now as we speak. He runs a major medical NGO. And my middle brother was a doctor for UNRWA as well in the beach refugee camp. He left Gaza a couple of years ago, and he's now in Europe. And so I would say that Gaza for me was a beautiful place that meant so much to me and its people. I was a masterful kite builder. We would go to Rafah in the south and build connections. I was of the generation that didn't have ubiquitous internet access. We had to actually talk to each other because there was no social media. The beach, the food, the sugar cane, the just the community component of it was really beautiful, and the weddings and the wedding parties. But I also experienced the violence associated with the direct Israeli military occupation around the Second Intifada, the presence of settlements. There were two main checkpoints in Gaza, the Netzarim corridor that you hear about. There was a small settlement in there, and there was an actual checkpoint that cut Gaza in kind of like a third of Gaza was trapped above that. And then there was another settlement called Gush Katif in the south, and that had another terrible checkpoint that we would spend hours a day at going to Rafah in and out of southern Gaza. I remember the bombardment and the escalation of violence, the ladder of escalation that started with incursions, and then it was with the armored vehicles, and then it was tanks, and then it was boats, and then it was Apache helicopters, and then it was F-16s. And I had a near-death experience in the year 2001 as an 11-year-old that rendered me largely deaf in my left ear and planted a seed that got me to want to leave the Gaza Strip and want to pursue something else. And so started learning English, which I thought was going to be a way out. I, in the year 2005, left Gaza as a junior in high school 1 month before the withdrawal of Israeli settlements. It was a year-long program that was supposed to only last a year. You come to the United States, live with a host family, and then you go back to your homeland and build cultural bridges. An exchange student by the State Department. And so I finished the program, and I went back to Egypt trying to cross into Gaza, but Hamas abducted Gilad Shalit, who was a young Israeli soldier, and that started a mini war in Gaza. There was also the 33-day war in Lebanon between the Hezbollah and Israel. So after 3 months being stuck in Egypt, I was able to return to the United States thanks to the support of peace and human rights activists. I started applying for political asylum status due to generalized and specific threats following Hamas's rise to political power. And Hamas's rise to political power is something that I actually observed and experienced up close as a child. I remember how they leverage their social services networks and how they use mosques and use religious institutions. They use schools to spread their ideology and incite against the Palestinian Authority and against the concept of two states and the ideas of working with Israel and the Palestinian Authority being somehow the purveyor of an incoming state. And so the very day of my political asylum interview in the United States was June 14th, 2007, which is the very day that Hamas violently took over the Gaza Strip and ejected the Palestinian Authority and kind of began the series of events that ultimately led to where we're at here, including October 7th. And so I became a citizen of the United States in 2014. That was 10 years ago. And I had a degree in business administration and worked in international development and the NGO sector. About a year and a half ago, I wanted to explore the world of international politics, geopolitics, and from a security lens, and obtain a degree in intelligence and national security, and went ahead and got a master's in that field, and thought I would work in foreign policy, the U.S. government. But then October 7th happened, and that was something that completely upended my life, and my life had never really been the same since, for a variety of reasons. I had been tracking in the lead up to October 7th multiple occurrences, or events, I should say, in threads that told me something bad was going to happen. Hamas was going to do something terrible. I had no idea it would be this scale, or this successful, or this damaging, or this destructive. But there were mass protests against the group. The Qataris were threatening to cut off funding for Hamas, the money that the suitcases full of cash that we know Netanyahu basically asked the Qataris to keep going, thinking he could buy off Hamas. And if you will, the granddaddy of them all was the prospect of Saudi-Israeli normalization that Hamas, and certainly others, but especially Hamas, viewed as an existential threat to the Palestinian cause. And really, the one who also viewed it as an existential threat was the Islamic Republic of Iran, because that Saudi-Israeli normalization was meant to create a Sunni alliance with Israel to confront Iran and isolate its proxy, and confront it and prevent it from acquiring a nuclear program. So I think the totality of those things made me confident. Oh yeah, and I did mention there were protests against Hamas in July and August, mass protests against the group. Their popularity was in the tank. They had failed as a governing body. They were repressing people. There was no, Gaza had 30% unemployment, 70% youth unemployment. 2/3 of Gazans were aid dependent. Hamas turned Gazans into aid dependent subjects, and kind of made the network of NGOs, including but not limited to UNRWA and all these other Arab, Muslim, and international NGOs responsible for administering the well-being of Palestinians in Gaza, when that really should have been the responsibility of Hamas as the governing body in charge.
Right. So when October 7th happened, and then we have the Israeli government reaction to October 7th, how did that impact you personally?
Well, as soon as October 7th unfolded, I was horrified on numerous levels. I was definitely horrified by just the scale of killing, and I thought that some of the acts on October 7th were unequivocally criminal and reprehensible, and just repulsive, and completely worthy of condemnation, critique. And I thought surely there would be, I thought naively perhaps, unanimous condemnation of going after civilians, taking of hostages, children and elderly women, and parading them around Gaza, and the abuse of hostages and the dead bodies. I was convinced that Gaza would be, in fact, flattened and would pay the ultimate price, and I was convinced that Gaza would face such a destructive war that would spare no one, and that my family, like millions of Palestinians in the coastal enclave, would pay the ultimate price. And so and similarly, I was also, or conversely, I was equally horrified by the kind of carte blanche dehumanization of the people of Gaza, and the portrayal of everybody in the coastal enclave as terrorists with Hamas who are out there to kill Jews, and the insistence that Hamas, all of Gaza is Hamas, and to not understand that, yes, we did see the scenes of people civilians going into Israel or participating in these reactions, what I think are shameful reactions to what happened. Still, we're talking about a few thousand people out of a very large civilian population that didn't start a war and can't stop it. And so my worst fears were realized when on 3 separate occasions there were 3 separate airstrikes that killed several of my immediate and extended family members, destroyed my family's home where I had grown up in Gaza City in the north, destroyed my second home, which is my mom's family home, lost over 31 family members. I was able to get some family members out. Some were left behind. Some we've lost contact with. But I lost dozens of children, 14 children under the age of 9, 7 elderly over the age of 60, teenagers, my 12-year-old Farah, my uncle Riyadh, who is day labor in Israel, who lived in our family, my dad's youngest brother, who lived in our family building and was one of the last people that I saw as I was leaving Gaza. And he told me that inshallah, when I come back after the withdrawal of Israeli settlements, things would be significantly better, and he would go back to working in Israel. And then on October 13th and October 25th, those were the strikes in Gaza. And then on December 14th was an especially deadly strike in Rafah that killed 29 people. And that was really, really exceptionally deadly and painful. And my brother went there and helped recover some of the bodies that were mutilated and some burnt beyond recognition, most headless, most are reduced to body parts, and most were recognized only as a part of a jigsaw puzzle, if you will, trying to remember people's layouts and putting the pieces together. I mean, really gruesome stuff. And I was at a crossroads as far as like, how do I want to react to this event? How do I want to deal with this? Do I want to give in to the natural inclination to be hateful and vengeful and insightful, if you will? Do I want to? I mean, throughout my time in the United States, I'd connected with Jews and Israelis, some of whom were strong allies, and I had worked through the different tiers of dialogue, conversation, engagement, discussions, and really developed an understanding, an empathetic understanding of where many Jews and Israelis were coming from. What is Zionism? What does that mean to many Jews? I mean, it means different things to different people. And it's a lot more than just the slur that is now regularly thrown around, Zionist this, Zionist that.
So I actually was having a conversation with an Iraqi friend about this, where they said they could be friends with the Israeli but not friends with the Zionist. And that word is so carelessly used right now. I actually feel like the way Muslims think of Zionists right now is the same way that Americans thought of Muslims right after 9/11. It's zero nuance.
Precisely that, and Zionism is an umbrella. Now, I understand. I think many Palestinians would tell you, and I would understand, that we've experienced the consequences of Zionism, if you will, as that their displacement and dispossession is the consequence of Zionism, and that also for Palestinians there is a belief, right or wrong, nevertheless it exists, that Zionism is this European modern invention, and they fail to see how Zionism is connected to Judaism, not just because the Zionists made their beliefs intricate to Judaism in a contemporary sense, but Zionism has always been about a combination of the return to the homeland, acknowledging the displacement of the Jewish people, and then coupled with, in a modern sense, a nation state, taking Jewish nationhood that had been and turning it into a modern and reincarnation through a nation state. And so I understand that a lot of Palestinians either just, they don't have the space in their hearts and minds for that level of nuance, because to them, Zionism, and to me as a child when I was in Gaza, my grandparents were pushed out in 1948. And my parents were born in refugee, like actual tents in 1950s in Rafah in southern Gaza. And it was, I mean, in the same way that people will tell you at the time, you know, that we just call the Jews and the Israelis call them the Arabs, like they never call them Palestinians. The Palestinians called them the Zionists, that they didn't call them the Israelis. So still, Zionism, and we're not here, I mean, it would take us a minute to like, but I've developed over the years like a much more nuanced understanding of that Zionism is not this monolithic thing. It means different things, and some people think that Zionism is a fait accompli and that like Israel exists, and like that was really like, and I've met some Jews who think that in a sense Zionism is irrelevant and that Israel exists and it achieved its goal. Some people believe it's the Jewish people's right to self-determination or statehood. Some people believe it's the Jewish people's right to be in the land. But one of the fallacies that exists in a lot of the pro-Palestine communities and many of the Arab and Muslim communities is this belief, and like that we can work, like we're just going to wait until Zionism is somehow irrelevant or shrinks to where most Jews and Israelis are going to become non-Zionists. And that is just complete hogwash, in my opinion, and a fantasy. Or, like, and years ago, I would accept this, but me personally, I don't personally believe that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic. However, anti-Zionism can and does often and regularly devolve into anti-Semitism, because the line has been blurred and the Overton window has shifted as far as like what constitutes anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism.
Sure,
and so,
there's a lot of overlap in the Venn diagram.
Precisely. So just stepping back from that a little bit and going back to like how I chose to react to the tragedy of my family, for which I catch a lot of crap from the pro-Palestine community or elements of them, is that I chose the unpopular route. I chose healing and reconciliation. I chose to honor the legacy of my fallen family members by breaking away from the vicious cycle of hatred, incitement, revenge, rinse and repeat. I chose to really prioritize connecting with survivors of October 7th, hostage families, former hostages, victims of October 7th, and to really humanize the Palestinian people, to have camaraderie around our suffering, and that this is not a suffering Olympics, even though clearly the suffering of Gaza is unprecedented and is the worst in Palestinian history. And acknowledging Israeli suffering doesn't in the slightest take away from my grievances. And I mean, the fact that I'm angry, I'm furious, I'm resentful, I'm frustrated, but I'm not hateful. And I'm not going to be consumed by I want to break away from that vicious cycle of hatred, incitement, violence, revenge, rinse and repeat that is so cyclical and commonplace in this conflict. And believe me, that is so much work on a daily basis. That is not easy. That is not some, fancy, sexy slogan. That takes daily commitment to withstand, because I get attacked all the time by the pro-Israel people who love me when I criticize Hamas and I criticize elements of the pro-Palestine movement and the Palestinian narrative that I think is in desperate need of reform and revision. But the minute I'm like, yes, and I think Netanyahu's a war crime, and I think Israel's war has far surpassed Israel's legitimate need to defend itself, and I think the settlement enterprise is out of control with the violence, and I think there needs to be two states, and I think this, and this, they lose it. They're like, I thought you were a real peace activist. Because there are those for whom peace means acquiescence to their narrative. Peace means being effectively their token. And there's a difference between people projecting, like attempting to tokenize you, and me tokenizing myself. I never do the latter. I am nobody's token. Just like I am not a token for the pro-Palestine people who can, because guess what? If I, like for example, I'll tell you a great example. A lot of the pro-Palestine people, and really like I would say 3/4 of the pro-Palestine people are simply anti-Israel. They're not really pro-Palestine. That doesn't mean I'm necessarily doubting their sincerity. Many are rightfully outraged. I am like, I absolutely, but like I've never been to a single pro-Palestine demo since this war began. Though in the past I used to support BDS and Student Justice for Palestine and protests and whatever. Like I interacted in the past with the pro-Palestine movement, but realized a lot of the shortcomings and the challenges of this group. But like people like to criticize the fact that I have been out of Gaza since 2005. And they like to and especially all these imbecile Palestinians that leave. The thing that I don't get are these Palestinians that leave Palestine, whether Gaza or the West Bank, and they go to Europe and they go to Luxembourg and they go to Geneva, and they're all pro-resistance and Hamas. Like, I can understand folks in the land having a hard time expressing their views, the community.
So I have a story about this for you. I was in Tampa, Florida, with a friend of mine from Afghanistan, and we met a Palestinian guy who was in Chicago, but spends his winters in Tampa because it's too cold in Chicago for the winter. Mm-hmm. And I told this guy that I'm trying to help a guy from Gaza move to the US right now, and this guy says, no, he shouldn't be coming here. He should be staying and fighting. I was like, but you leave Chicago because it's too cold for you in the winter. But you want this guy to, like, stay and fight in Gaza?
Well, people said that to me when I was 17, and I tried to get political asylum, and they said, oh, no, like, you're part of, like, the Zionist plot to engage in a brain drain. And this was some lady in San Francisco, and I was like, well, you're certainly welcome to like trade places with me if you'd like. I mean, I don't get how, a 20-something-year-old person can, like to me. So anyway, going back to the earlier point, like people try to like delegitimize me. They have a hard time because I am critical of the Israeli government. I do. But then they're like, oh, you don't criticize the Israeli government enough. I speak perfect Arabic. Like, I have family there. My family are Muslim hijabis. And like, so they're like pulling out their hair because I'm not Yosef Haddad. I'm not Musab Hassan Yusuf, the crazy son of Hamas. I'm not like some maniacal crazy guy. I'm like genuinely like, I care about Palestinians. I want Palestinian rights and freedom and liberation and independence. And I think we've been going in a disaster after disaster. So they're just like desperate to delegitimize me. So then they're like, basically they'll try to go into something like, oh, well, you've been living out of Gaza for a while. And these people have been like living in Europe. Like, they're like, you don't know Gaza. You don't know. And what's so and you cannot speak on behalf of the Palestinian people. What's so funny is like the Palestinian people who are the least accurately represented people, because we've never had really like free elections since 2006. We're not a free society. We're not a liberal society. We're not a democratic society. We don't have representative governments. We don't have real leaders. And yet, everybody speaks on our behalf. Everybody speaks over us and for us. But when a critical Palestinian voice tries to speak, either other imbecile Palestinians or other pro-Palestine diaspora, they're like, well, you're not representative of the Palestinians. You haven't lived there for a while. You can't speak about it. But if I were saying Israel genocide, Israel apartheid, blah, 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 if I were repeating the script, I'm willing to bet you my heart and brain that they wouldn't ever bring up the fact that I've been out of Gaza for a while. They would never say anything remotely to try to delegitimize me. And in fact, they would say Ahmed is the most legitimate guy to speak about. It's like everybody, in a way, the pro-Palestine people, and whether they be Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, or otherwise, particularly the leftists and the crazies, are just as tokenizing as the pro-Israel community. And I occupy this unique space where I use the word pro-Palestine to reclaim what it means to be pro-Palestine. And I very much so am interested in interfaith dialogue. I believe in the Jewish people's historic lineage. I don't believe that somehow justifies going into the West Bank and like harassing and killing Palestinians because of a biblical claim from thousands of years ago. Nevertheless, I believe that there could still be a way that this can be figured out. And yet, again, it's like being in this no man's land is so challenging. And that's not just unique to this conflict, by the way. I would argue, for example, like I have serious concerns about the Syrian rebels. I don't think exactly that they're going to be the overseers of democratic governance and freedom. At the same time, I despise the Assad regime and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I would love nothing more than to see him out of power. So you can hold space for multiple truths. I am against October 7th, and I want the hostages released. And I want the end of the armed resistance narrative that has gotten us more occupation, more death, more killings. And I want Israel's military occupation and the oppression to end. You can be for both. Like, this does not have to be a zero-sum game. And the combination of academics that we have, plus with the politicians, plus with the activists, plus with the media personalities. I mean, that I am one of the few voices in the English-speaking world who are legitimately Palestinian and saying what I'm saying, like, something is wrong there, James. Like, it's not just that I'm this courageous, holier than thou. Like, there are people that are 50 times smarter than me who, behind closed doors, are thinking this. Like, so there's this, like, famous lady for Al Jazeera, and they fired her recently, thank God, who's like, I wonder, and she's not even, like, Palestinian, and she was like, I wonder what the Israelis have on him. Like, she suggested that the Israelis have sex tapes on me, and that I am simply saying this, which is hilarious, because I literally said I support the ICC arresting Netanyahu. I showed that I had a mega viral post with like 6-7 million shares and views and whatever, in which I shared that New York Times story showing the like bullet x-rays, whatever, and the pro-Israel people came after me super hard. And like, I don't know, I go after the Israeli government at will whenever I have a story or a reason to. So like, it's stripping the Palestinians of their agency. And by the way, I recognize that there is an imbalance of power dynamics between Palestinians and Israelis. But what I always argue is that even within the confines of this imbalance exists room for Palestinian agency, responsibility, and accountability. October 7th was a choice, not a necessity or an inevitability. And I'll leave you with this. It's like this Italian the other day. I was talking to an Italian journalist, economist, famous gentleman, who basically said that Palestinians can't be expected to be civilized because the Israelis have just brutalized them, and the Israelis have stripped them of their agency, and therefore Palestinians are basically not going to act in a civilized manner. And I just thought that was incredibly racist and incredibly, like, Palestinians are capable of exercising agency just like any other people, even if they're oppressed.
So I want to hit, next time we talk, I really want to hit on a larger discussion about how groupthink plays into this. We just don't have time for it today. What I'd really like to hear, though, is one of the things that's been concerning me from the beginning of this is that people have all these plans about what they want to happen in this conflict, but very few people have any sort of constructive vision for the future or what that looks like. So for you, what are you actually working towards? What are you hoping is going to happen as a result of this? What do you think is possible right now?
I think what's possible, which, like the solving this conflict, in my opinion, begins in Gaza. I think what's possible is that Gaza, after 20 years of complete failure and a complete waste of opportunity and time following the withdrawal of Israeli settlements, now there's a unique opportunity out of the sheer destruction and the death and the killing and the maiming to actually not just reconstruct Gaza, but ensure that there's a process of recovery, rejuvenation, and a renaissance. I think what's possible is that Gaza becomes the crown jewel of the Palestinian people, and that Gaza becomes a role model for effective Palestinian self-governance and a model for what an occupation-free West Bank looks like. I think Gaza should be the place from which trust rebuilding between Palestinians and Israelis can be initiated, because that's where the worst form of the loss of trust took place on October 7th. And so I am working towards a big picture vision for Gaza's recovery and rejuvenation, such that it can be a vibrant place that is not a platform for terrorism, that is not a platform for violence or Islamism or Hamas's armed resistance, that is instead a space where that evolves to become the pride and joy of the Palestinian people. And the West Bank is not in ruins in the same way that the Gaza Strip is, but I think in a way the West Bank could be a lot more if it has an opportunity to expand, and if it's given territory to not only build up more cities, but, for example, I want to envision a scenario in which the right of return for the Palestinian refugees happens to a future Palestinian state. There will not be the return of millions of Palestinian refugees and their descendants to mainland Israel. And so you solve Gaza, you begin to envision how the West Bank can be expanded and how you can actually dismantle. And I'm sorry, but I don't care that it was Judea and Samaria thousands of years ago. In a contemporary sense, this was land that was acquired through military occupation, and now, as we speak, through illegal seizures and thuggery and criminality. And that does not change the fact that this is the space that is agreed upon as the future land of the Palestinian state. And I think territorial swaps, I think, like, it doesn't have to be a 1-for-1 67 border. So that's what I think can happen.
On the sort of historic Judea and Samaria thing, I don't know if you've ever heard this story, but the first king of Israel is a guy called Saul, and one thing that he did wrong is in 2 Samuel 21, and there's a group of people called the Gibeonites who are non-Israelites that lived in the land with them, and it says, so the king, this is David now, called the Gibeonites, and he spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but the remnant of the Amorites, although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them. Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. And God actually demands justice for the Gibeonites that had been killed in Saul out of his zeal for the Israelite people. So even if this was 2,000 years ago with King David on the throne, that doesn't excuse shady, that doesn't excuse shady expansionism.
And to be clear, I would love for the Jewish people to have access to parts of the West Bank that are holy and I think that can be figured out, arranged, dealt with, coordinated, collaborated around, and made possible. I am simply saying that this imposition by force, I mean, the Overton window has shifted to where we went from, it was the normal position to say that these settlements were illegal, to now it's like, well, it's just Judea and Samaria, and now Senator Tom Cotton is introducing legislation to make it illegal to use the word West Bank in all federal communication to describe this. And so I am concerned by the, in the same way we need de-radicalization in Palestinian society, we also need de-radicalization in Israeli and Jewish societies, because it takes two to tango. And I am very confident that Palestinian moderates and pragmatists, if empowered with wins on the ground, and wins means you give them actual wins, you don't do what Netanyahu did, which is use Hamas as leverage against the moderate Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and weaken the Palestinian Authority so that you have the Palestinians politically divided, so that you don't have a partner for peace. I mean, actually, allow the Palestinians autonomy, actually prevent settlers from engaging in violence, actually prevent the seizure of lands in the Jordan Valley, such that you can have the development and evolution of a Palestinian state that can absolutely not threaten Israel. And Israel already has the wall and has the military spread. I mean, I thought that was the whole point of the IDF, is the advanced, the billions of dollars that the United States and others have pumped into it, and the walls and the technology. I mean, I don't think an October 7th attack will ever happen again anytime soon. I understand the trauma. I don't really understand what it's like, but I understand that there is trauma. I understand that in the same way that I hope to God there's a willingness to understand the trauma that exists in Gaza. Because again, those channels, they can't cross over each other. They have to be intertwined. Okay, empathy for Israelis and empathy for Palestinians as a pragmatic pathway forward to implement effective policies. I think this conflict is solvable. We need leadership, we need creative thinking, we need hard steps, and we need to shift the Overton window back to where it was just 10 years ago and not normalize shady expansionism in the name of the grandiose fulfillment of a biblical prophecy. Because I respect wholeheartedly the Jewish people's connection to the Holy Land, and I have pleaded with fellow Palestinians and Muslims to really understand that as a dimension to this whole thing, and that the Jewish people are not just and that the Jews of Europe and whatever, they have lineage that traces back to the Middle East. I get that. But that understanding is not infinite if it comes at the expense of the Palestinian people. And guess what? It doesn't have to. And I don't believe it has to. The problem is there will have to be small incremental change, which nobody wants to hear that. Palestinians don't want to hear that. Palestinians are saying, screw incremental change. We've been under occupation for all these years. The settlers are burning our trees. They've taken over all of our land. There's nothing left. And I don't have an answer to that. I hear their grievances. Their grievances are right. And what else is there beyond proving to ourselves, to the world, and certainly to Israelis, that we can handle sovereignty and that we're not violent and that we will not replicate what Hamas did? Because guess what? And I really will leave you with this. Palestinian freedom and liberation cannot happen in a vacuum without buy-in and support from Israelis. We need Israelis for our emancipation and our freedom and our liberty. And I know that people find that really hard to swallow and understand, but I wholeheartedly believe that no amount of international delegitimization, no amount of isolation, no amount of attacks will get Israel to shift course until and unless, and that the de-radicalization in Israel relies on the Palestinians demonstrating to a significant enough number of Israelis that we want to live with you. We acknowledge your presence. We acknowledge your legitimacy. We hear you, and we're not going to harm you. We want to live in peace with you. And I think within a generation, that could quickly reverse the radicalization trends inside of Israel.
Right. I mean, I think if everyone has the attitude of, ancient history aside, both your grandparents and my grandparents were born here. Like this is a conflict between the grandparents of people who were born in the land at this point. Certainly. And kicking someone out at this point is just not realistic or legitimate, no matter what the history was.
Precisely.
Well, thank you so much for being a reasonable, pragmatic voice in this. It's so needed at this point in history. I think from what I'm encountering, there are so many more people that think like you who are Palestinian, but they're afraid to say that publicly because the groupthink is so pervasive in a lot of ways. Precisely. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next time we talk, and I'm looking forward to that. But for now, thank you for being on the Al Maida Initiative podcast, and thank you guys for listening.